how our brains work. One, we think in metaphors. Without metaphors, we wouldn't know who we are, right? We're always comparing something to something else. It's how comedy works, it's how stories work, it's how we think of ourselves, right? If you see yourself as a good person, what does that mean? Oh, it means I'm like blah, 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 right? Like something else. We think in metaphors. So almost everything our brain does and all of our emotions stem from the metaphors behind that emotion. So two, those metaphors then inform our emotions. Our emotions cause us to feel a certain way. So those metaphors are our subconscious. When I say we have subconscious blocks, that's what I mean. What are the metaphors behind those emotions? And those metaphors, that subconscious, leads us to certain emotions. And those emotions then go to step 3, which is we act in line with both our metaphors and our emotions. So we act. Step 3 is we act. So step 1 is we think in metaphors. Step 2 is those metaphors cause an emotion. And step 3, those emotions cause us to act in a certain way. Which leads us to step 4. We then explain with logic, after the fact, why we did what we did. And if we're fine with how we acted and the logic of how we acted, then we stay the same. And we stay in this loop of metaphor, emotion, action, logic. And we just go in this loop and everything is fine. That's our comfort zone, right? That's where we stay unless we want to change. And if we want to change, then we add an extra step. And what we do is we add a step 5 of we try to use logic to explain our logic. And sometimes that logic helps us to take a new action. And if we take this action long enough, we can start to change how we feel about this thing. And if we change how we feel about the thing, we will often change the metaphor that we have, right? So we try to use logic to explain our logic, which then changes our actions, which then may change our emotions, which then may change our metaphors. And the problem with that is that it doesn't generally stick like that. This is why most self-directed change doesn't work, is because we're using logic to explain our logic. And it doesn't get to the root of our metaphors, our emotions, or our actions to begin with. A lot of what we do in this program is that we're working specifically on the metaphors, right? The stories that we have about our emotions. And if we can change the metaphors directly, then we change how we feel about the thing and then we just take the action. The problem sometimes isn't that we've changed our metaphors or not, it's whether or not our logic brain, right, that step 5, the logic about our logic makes sense to us. And if we feel like that wasn't enough, if just changing the metaphor to change our emotions, to change our actions, if we get to 4 and we explain it, we're like, I don't know why I changed. And so it's not enough. If we can't identify how that is to us, then we resist that change again. So we both need to change the metaphors and the reasoning behind our logic, behind our actions. And what that means is we need to change the original metaphor and how we see ourselves. And if we can explain how we see ourselves and the original metaphor, it's almost guaranteed that you'll make that change. And some people use that explanation super simply, right? They're like, oh, I liked that thing before, I don't like it anymore. And that's what they do. This is something like cigarettes, right? They've smoked 30 years of their life. They're like, oh, I needed it before, but now I don't. They just stop cold turkey because they're like, oh, I knew I was having a son, I didn't want to smoke anymore. And that's their logic, and it works for them, and that's enough. For other people, they're like, oh, I need to know why I started this. Oh, it's because my parents, and then it was good for stress, and then it just built on, and I got addicted physically. And so they need to know all the logic. So like, for some people, a simple explanation is enough, and others, they need to know every step. But in both cases, they've also changed the metaphor. Before, a metaphor for the cigarette was, it helps me relax. So they just saw themselves as relaxing when they smoked. And then when they stopped smoking, they're like, oh, that's super unhealthy. I see black lungs, right? So instead of relaxing, they see their health being decimated. And so this is how people change. They change the metaphor, which then changes how they feel about the thing and the actions. And this is why self-discipline by itself is hard to do, because you're working backwards. With that said, a lot of the things that we do in this program are geared towards changing the metaphors. And ideally, after you've changed the metaphor, you do understand yourself better. And so you are able to change the logic and the metaphor simultaneously. So if you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to let me know.